Hello, Tanny here to walk you through how I added color blocking to my open back halter top pattern. If you haven't seen the construction video, I'm going to link it up below, but this is how we got to that final design. So I'm just going through the tool and I'm adding my measurements, and then I'm opening it up in Adobe Illustrator. And I'm editing my artboard to give me a bit more working space because I'm going to move things around, and I'm going to trace some of the pieces out and add my seam allowance, but that is what I'm doing here. I'm locking that first layer, adding a second layer, and then we're getting to work. So I'm going to use the red color red, and then we're using the line segment. I'm moving in my first blocking is going to be, I guess, 2 centimeters from the neck point, and then I'm going to use my Bezier curve tool to draw in that design line. We want to make sure that when we're drawing in these design lines that the design line is perpendicular to the shoulder. This is just best practice in terms of pattern drafting in general. You want to make sure that you have perpendicular design lines, so that way your seams are trued. Now what I'm doing is I'm adding in color blocking. So if you watch the construction video, I have a black neck piece. So this is a way that we're going to add binding without a binder, and by using fold over elastic. So you don't even need a binder. You don't need a fancy cover stitch machine. You can literally use a zigzag stitch and a regular sewing machine to do your binding, and it'll come out looking really professional. So that first piece that's inside the red lines, essentially that's going to be mesh, and the piece that I'm tracing out right now, that's going to be my black binding piece. Although now in hindsight, when I was working with this, I think I made the binding piece a bit too thin, and it was very difficult to work with. I was using 1/4 of an inch elastic, and so the margins were very tiny. The elastic just fit, so it was quite challenging to put the pieces together. And also matching up those curves was a bit of a challenge. So I think in the future, I'm going to try just using a straight strip instead of color blocking, and then see how that goes, and set up my pattern like I would as typically when you're adding binding without seam allowance. So keep tuned for that video when I experiment that method. But the color blocking with that tiny neck piece was a bit of a challenge. We got it done and it looked great in the end, but it was finicky to work with. So as you can see, I'm tracing off all my pieces. So that middle piece is going to be mesh. And if you want to do color blocking, it could obviously be a different color. Mesh, and then we have our black neck piece, which is going to be the binding, and this is going to be the main fabric colored piece. And I just push those over to the side, and then I'm going to add my black binding piece to my back panel. So you can see that I'm adding I don't know how long I made that piece. 1 centimeter. Okay. Wow. Really, really narrow margins in there, Tanya. So I make that piece perpendicular, so it's trued with my front piece, and then I'm doing the same thing on the center back. So lining it up and then moving that line to be 90 degrees. And then I'm going to just use my pen tool to draw in a Bezier curve to connect the two. So there is the Bezier curve, and I'm making sure that the handles don't pass each other so we have a nice curve. And then I'm just going to trace this piece out, and we're going to add in our seam allowance to it after we trace it out. So like I mentioned, this method was a bit challenging when I was trying to match up the seams together in my final construction. So I do want to try just cutting out essentially binding like 1 centimeter, 1.2 centimeter binding pieces, and then doing it that way. So as if I was actually doing binding, but I'm going to use the same construction method. So essentially you're cutting out 2 pieces each, and then you're sewing them on right sides together, and then you're folding them back up to then sew the elastic on, so that first seam is concealed, and then you sew on the elastic, you fold over the elastic, and then the binding has a really nice clean finish. So here I am just tracing off the rest of the back panel minus my color block neck piece. And then I'm going to put that over to the side, and then I'm going to add my seam allowance. I think I may mirror them. I'm not personally a fan of cutting on the fold when it comes to working with spandex, just because you can't fold it over very neatly. But it depends on your style in your cutting room. So you see I'm adding the seam allowance here. I'm doing 1/4 of an inch and a little bit, so that way when I'm pushing this through the overlocker, I'm cutting off a bit of a margin with a knife, so that way the stitching lays really neatly. And you can see, yeah, I'm just mirroring my pieces because personally that's a function of style. This is how I prefer to work. And like I mentioned, we're going to be cutting out essentially 2 pieces each of our neck binding, because we're going to sew them on right sides together and wrong sides together. So we're sandwiching our main pattern in the middle and then folding our pieces up. So yeah, the cut on the fold, I personally like to just mirror it. But yeah, so let's skip through to when I add the seam allowance. Just kidding. I don't add seam allowance for some reason, but I did show you how you can add seam allowance in Adobe Illustrator. So you would go path and offset path, and then you're good to go. And if you're interested in trying the My Slope open back halter top, head on over to myslope.com. You can purchase the pattern, and then after you purchase it, you just log in via the drafting library. So it's the purple one there. Log in, and there you go. You got access to the tool. All right, I look forward to seeing what you create.